right? And how that's 80% of the spin, or 80% of the death, 86% of the spin, and then basically I alluded to the fact that you can stay away from that. Here is how to stay away from that. Energy for fuel, energy basically either gets burnt or stored, etc. Now, there's a couple of physiological mechanisms that are at play when we do that. We're going to attempt to discuss glucose and insulin and how insulin contributes to metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is the big door that unlocks chronic disease. Okay, so 3 types of macronutrients: protein, fat, and carbs. Today we're going to talk about carbs. Does everybody know what carbs are? Bread. 2.5 grams in a Mick Ultra, correct? That is correct. So alcohol would be one, yeah. Carbs, fruit, sugar, sweets. Okay, so here's just a good rule of thumb, right? So basically, if it's in a box, bag, or has a barcode on it, odds are it's carbohydrate. Or if it tastes good, okay? And then another rule of thumb is if you look at the nutrition ingredients, yes, there will be mixed, there will be proteins, fats, and carbs, but always look at the carbohydrate count. If that's the highest of the 3, you're basically eating a carb, okay? So we'll talk more about that later. But anyway, so when we take these things in carbohydrates, okay, our body breaks them down and processes them into glucose. Just glucose is another word for sugar. So when you hear blood sugar, we're discussing blood glucose levels, okay? Carbs, glucose. Here's what happens. When your blood sugar goes up as a response to eating the carbohydrates, there's a little hormone, actually it's a big hormone called insulin. Insulin is made in the pancreas. So it signals insulin to be released as basically kind of like, think of insulin as like a transporter or a lock and key, or basically it's glucose's homie to get him to where he wants to go, okay? Where does he want to go, Jeff? Good question. He wants to go to the cells, specifically the first 3 that he's really looking for is the liver. So you store that. When you store it, it's called glycogen, okay? So it gets stored in the liver because we need that to do all kinds of cool stuff. Here's another cool thing. We want it to go to our muscles, right? But here's the bad thing. If we top off the liver and we top off the muscles, what happens next, Sarah? Where does it need to go? It's got to go somewhere. Your butt, your gut, your hips, your wherever. So in this case, we're just going to call fat, okay? Or adipose tissue. Okay? Everybody tracking with me so far? More carbs we eat, more the insulin goes up, the more that stuff's got to be stored somewhere. And once you top off your liver or your muscle, it's got to be stored in fat tissue. Here's the other bad part though. If this glucose keeps circling around because we've put it in the liver and we've put it in the muscles and it's attempting to make fat storage, the more glucose that's in our blood, what's happening? More insulin. So basically, there you go, all right? So if you're not insulin sensitive, you become insulin resistant, right? Which basically means that insulin, your endogenous insulin pump just keeps flooding your system with insulin. That is called hyperinsulemia. I'm not even going to try to just write it real fast, okay? Hyperinsulemia, all right? That leads to insulin resistance. And that's just basically saying it's so hard for your cells to absorb glucose now, right? Because your body is essentially flooded with all this blood sugar that it's very difficult for it to go unless it gets stored as fat tissue, right? And I'm not going to attempt to go into the biochemical response on how all that stuff works, but now, where does insulin resistance lead to, Barb? Oh, there we go. Yes. Okay. Type 2 diabetes. Right? So you got to go through these steps to get you here. Now, here's the bad news. This also leads to metabolic syndrome, and that is all the bad chronic diseases we talked about. Okay? So cardiovascular disease, it starts as a result of this, and basically this leads to help thickening of the arterial walls. That's how you get strokes and blood or in cardiovascular disease. Obviously, this is going to lead to obesity. They go hand in hand. Obesity leads to systemic inflammation, right? Systemic inflammation leads to all kinds of bad stuff. We also talked about as you age, you get Alzheimer's, dementia. That's nothing more than diabetes of the brain. And then, what's cancer's favorite fuel? There we go. All this is just, right? It's right, because cancer, it's cancerous cells. Cancerous cells need what? They need energy. Their preferred method of energy is glucose. More sugar you have in your system, the more you're going to feed those cancerous cells. So there are, nutritional therapy outlets. Fasting is a great one because it's super easy. Why? When you don't consume anything, what's the insulin have to do? Shuts down to normal levels. Okay. Now, here's the bad part. Here comes like all the dogmatic approaches to nutrition. Am I saying low carb? You could infer that. I'm saying lower carb. I'm saying just enough carbs to use for fuel, for you to use for activity, but not for storage. What is that? I will give you a very general prescription. Now, that good number per day will change. Why? Because your activity levels change. Higher activity level, the more you can consume carbohydrates. And I really didn't get into it here, but basically, carbohydrates they're not the devil, right? They do fuel activity. We just don't want them to fuel storage. So, the more active you are, the more you can consume that blood glucose. And here's the other thing.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, so like sugar. So there's sugar in fruit. So can you eat fruit?
Yes.
Is that still?
Here's why. Okay. Here's why. Yes, fruits do have sugar in them. Which is better, an apple or table sugar? Right? Why? Because there's fiber. There's a bunch of other micronutrients in there that slows the digestion of turning that carbs into glucose. You ever heard of high glycemic or low glycemic foods? All that is a measurement to how much that will spike your blood sugar. Broccoli, as you can imagine, super fucking low, right? Potato or a white potato or a banana is a little higher, okay? But that's okay. No one ever got fat from eating fucking fruit. No one. I don't give a shit who you are. Sorry, Brooks. No one got fat from eating fruit. What do you get fat from? The bags, the barcodes, and all the bullshit, right? Now, here's the other good part. So the more active we are, the more we could, in theory, consume carbohydrates. The more, Robert, the more muscle you have. Because your muscle basically acts as a sponge for that glycogen. You ever heard of skinny fat? You can be skinny fat, right, and be metabolically deranged because you don't have a lot of muscle mass. Okay? So next week we'll talk about protein and all that stuff, but it starts excess glucose, excess insulin, insulin resistance. Insulin resistance leads to disease. Disease leads to death. All that stuff that we talked about. On the